My name is Taylor Goldman. I'm in 4B, and this is my video on the process of cellular respiration.
Cellular respiration is a process that takes the products of photosynthesis, which are sugar and oxygen, and breaks them down into carbon dioxide, water, and produces a lot of energy. This process is done in the mitochondria and is illustrated by the diagram shown here. Today I will be explaining how each aspect of cellular respiration has its own unique part and how it does its cycle to help in the process. The first step in cellular respiration is glycolysis, which occurs right outside of the mitochondria, right in this area. Glycolysis is the first step in cellular respiration and is the process of sugar cutting to cut glucose in half. And it happens outside the mitochondria, as illustrated here outside of the mitochondria, in the cytoplasm of the cell. It is very important because it is used to cut glucose in half. Glucose is one of the reactants of cellular respiration, and it is from a product of photosynthesis. Glucose comes into the cytoplasm of the cell and is used outside the mitochondria in glycolysis. Glucose is broken down to form pyruvate. It forms pyruvate because energy is invested, glucose is split in half, and it loses energy and forms a pyruvate. Once the glucose forms a pyruvate, it no longer exists. NADH is an electron carrier that is already existing within the cell. NADH is used to transport electrons from the Krebs cycle all the way over to the electron transport chain. NADH occurs when a molecule of NAD over here picks up electrons from the carbon molecule, and it acts as a carrier to transport electrons to the chain. NADH cycles back to its original job once it returns to NAD+, once it releases the electrons into the transport chain. The cytoplasm is the medium of the entire cell, and it is the place where glycolysis occurs. The cytoplasm in this diagram is anything outside of the mitochondria, outlined here. The cytoplasm is very important because it provides a medium for glycolysis to occur. The pyruvate comes from the molecule of glucose that was split in half during the first part of glycolysis. The molecule of glucose split in half and lost energy and leaves a 3-carbon molecule, which is a pyruvate. The pyruvate goes through glycolysis and passes through the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Once it passes through this membrane, the pyruvate loses 1 carbon and is no longer a pyruvate anymore. Carbon dioxide is a product of cellular respiration and comes from the pyruvate that enters the mitochondria. Once the pyruvate enters the mitochondria, it loses a carbon that bonds with 2 molecules of oxygen that forms carbon dioxide as a byproduct. This carbon dioxide is made as a byproduct and leaves the cell as waste during exhalation. The inner membrane is the inner membrane in the mitochondria, outlined by these light gray lines here. That's the best place I could put it. The inner membrane is the location of the electron transport chain, which is the third step of cellular respiration. The chain is embedded within the inner membrane, which makes the membrane very important because it's used as a place for the transport chain to occur. The Krebs cycle happens after the making of coenzyme A, which happens in between glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle occurs right here in the matrix of the mitochondria, which is kind of the center area, the medium of the mitochondria. The purpose of the Krebs cycle is to produce energy in the form of NADH and FADH2 by oxidizing acetyl-CoA. The Krebs cycle is important because it leads us to the electron transport chain. The matrix is the gel-like material where the Krebs cycle takes place. It is kind of the inside of the mitochondria, everything inside the inner membrane. It is very important because it's used for a medium for the Krebs cycle to take place. ATP is produced by the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle, and is made for each molecule of glucose. Hydrogen ions flow across the inner membrane through a turbine, and this flow spins the turbine, which activates the production of ATP from existing ADP molecules that gain a phosphate group during this process. ATP is lost as a waste product and is one of the products of cellular respiration because cellular respiration has the goal of creating energy in the form of ATP. The electron transport chain is the last step in cellular respiration and occurs over here. It happens in the inner membrane of the mitochondria as the transport chain is embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. The electron transport chain is where electrons are carried from one carrier to the next to make the final product of ATP and energy and break down the glucose and oxygen molecules completely that were the reactants of cellular respiration. The last aspect I will be explaining is FADH2. FADH2 is created from the Krebs cycle, which occurs in the matrix. It occurs when a molecule of FAD plus picks up electrons from the carbon molecule, and FADH2 acts as the carrier to get these molecules to the third step in the electron transport chain. FADH2 cycles back once it drops off its electrons and returns to FAD plus because it has released its electrons into the chain and returns to do the same thing over and over and over again.
Cellular respiration is a very important process that is essentially the opposite of photosynthesis, as it makes carbon dioxide and water, and most importantly, ATP, or energy. This energy is then used by the cell for all the processes it needs to carry out. The products of cellular respiration are recycled and used as the reactants for photosynthesis.